Hello, my name is Dr. A.J. Smith, and this is Religion 102, Introduction to the New Testament. I want to point you briefly in the direction of the syllabus. My contact hours and contact information are in the syllabus and on Moodle on the course website, so be sure to look there for how to reach me. You can always send me an email and I will respond promptly. My phone number's there, and my Skype account and my Skype hours are posted as well. Three things you need to know from the syllabus. Textbooks. You have to have the ESV Study Bible. It looks like this. Let's see if I can get it on the camera right. There's reading material in here besides the biblical text that is testable material. So you'll want to get a copy of this ESV Study Bible. Also, you're going to need the IVP Introduction to the Bible. This is your book. This will also be the book for Religion 101. Both of these will be used in Religion 101, Old Testament. So you're going to get maximum mileage out of these books. And you'll have quizzes that will cover the reading material in these books. In addition, you will write a book report on Etta Linneman's book, Historical Criticism of the Bible. All the details about this are in the syllabus. The learning outcomes are in the syllabus. So I'm pointing you really to the syllabus at this point. Be sure you look through it carefully. A couple of things of note in the syllabus. One, we use Turnitin to check for originality. This is to guard against plagiarism, accidental or otherwise. Faculty can't tell the difference between accidental plagiarism and deliberate plagiarism. We, as Turabian says, read words, not minds. For a full explanation of plagiarism, I would suggest you read Kate Turabian's A Manual for the Writers of Term Papers, Theses, and Dissertations, 8th edition, Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Remember to be respectful at all times in any correspondence with fellow students. And the course requirements are laid out in the syllabus. There's 10 20-point reading quizzes. Usually they're 20 questions. Sometimes they're more, sometimes they're less. Those are closed book, closed note. There's 2 exams, a midterm and a final. They're worth 100 points each, and they are open note, open book. And then there's the book report, which should be 700 to 1,000 words in 12-point Times New Roman font. Details for how to set that up are explained in the syllabus. Make sure you submit that only as either a Word document or a Corel Word Perfect document. I won't be able to grade it if you submit it in any other way. Okay, so make sure you submit it in that way. The grading scale is in the syllabus. The course schedule is in the syllabus. This is Module 1. And so you're going to want to be sure you keep up with that course schedule and follow it closely. And the last thing you'll see in the syllabus is an example of what your title page should look like for your book report. Remember that when you fill in those spaces there where the brackets are, that you take the brackets out. There should be no page number on your title page. The title of your book should be italicized, but nothing else should be. Fill in the data where it's bracketed and take the brackets out, and you'll be fine. Okay, so that is a quick run through of the syllabus. Now, as we think about the course in the beginning of the course, I want to read to you from Galatians chapter 4, beginning in verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. This is Paul's way of saying the time was just right. God's never early, God's never late. He's always on time, is what Paul is telling us. And this was exactly the right time. Now, I think historically we look at this and we see this was exactly the right time for the coming of Jesus and the coming of the gospel. So, with that said, we're going to look at the background of the New Testament for just a few minutes and look at some factors there. Okay, we have the intertestamental period, which begins with the close of the Old Testament. There's a 450 year gap between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. This is called the intertestamental period. We have the late Persian period, is where the Old Testament closes. During this time period, we have the beginnings of the synagogue, we have the beginnings of rabbinical tradition, the beginning of the Pharisees and the Sadducees as competing religious groups within the Israelite community. Uh, this flows over into the Greek period. Once Alexander the Great conquers the Persians, the Greek period begins, and Alexander's not just conquering, he's spreading Hellenistic culture. Alexander dies right as he completes his conquest. He dies as a young man. And his kingdom is divided among his generals. And in the west, two dynasties are established from that. In Syria, out of Antioch, is the Seleucid dynasty, and in Egypt is the Ptolemies. And they are constantly competing for control of this strip of land that was ancient Israel and Lebanon and Syria, known as the Levant, because this is the trade route from the east to Africa. And so they're constantly fighting one another for control of this territory. And at the same time, there's Hellenistic influences from both sides being pushed onto the Jews living here. And sometimes the Jews are more prone to give in to that, sometimes they're not, but that's the situation they're dealing with. Eventually, things become so intolerable under the Seleucids that the priesthood stages a revolt. And the Hasmonean dynasty is founded, controlled by the priesthood in Jerusalem. And this dynasty lasts roughly 100 years or so. And Israel enjoys some degree of independence until the rise of the Romans. And Herod the Great, that we know of from the New Testament, actually marries a daughter of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so by virtue of marriage, he's entitled to the title of King of the Jews, even though he's not a Jew. He's an Edomite. He's from Idumea, which is Edom. But also politically, he's given this position by Julius Caesar, because he sided with Julius Caesar against Pompey. And guess who won? Julius Caesar. And Caesar rewarded Herod with the title of King of the Jews. And so Herod is in close political ties with Rome. And this brings us into the Roman period. The Roman period is the period we know of in the New Testament. After Herod's death, some of his sons reign over parts of his territory, and at times governors and different Roman authorities reign over portions of the Holy Land. And this is who we're dealing with. We also have a group here called the Samaritans. We have Jews living in Galilee to the north and in Judea to the south, and sandwiched in the middle is Samaria. And Samaria is named after the capital of the old ancient northern kingdom of Israel, which the capital city was Samaria. And so the province of Samaria is there. And these Samaritans, who are they? Where did they come from? Well, they're the product of intermarriage between Israelites and non-Israelites who settled in the land after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom. And so the rest of the Jews consider these Samaritans to be half-breeds, and they want nothing to do with them if at all possible. They consider them unclean and unfaithful to the law of Moses. Even though the Samaritans embraced the Torah, the Samaritans built their own rival temple in Gerizim, where they had temple worship. And but they had to deal with this issue of racial prejudice. And we'll see this highlighted as we move through the New Testament. We'll see a lot of racial prejudice between Jews and Samaritans in there. There are various Jewish religious groups that need to be considered. The Sadducees and Pharisees both had their origins in the intertestamental period. As rival groups, the Sadducees were primarily from the priestly group. They hold to the Torah as the Word of God, but only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. oftentimes referred to as the Pentateuch. The Pharisees, on the other hand, embrace all of the Hebrew scriptures that we know today, which would be what we would call the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew Bible, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And the Sadducees rejected a resurrection, an afterlife, and angels. They didn't believe in any of that. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed in a resurrection. They believed in an afterlife. They believed in angels and demons and all of it. So there's a huge divide between them. And the Pharisees made a great work of studying the law and seeking to understand the law so that they could live it properly. At the same time, we have another group, a very strict, we might say fundamentalist group called the Essenes that developed during this time period as well, probably during the Greek period. And they consider all of these others to be apostate, corrupt, compromised, and they withdraw and they live in communities out in the wilderness. They observe a very ascetic lifestyle. They are very strict in how they dress, in how they bathe, in how they eat, in how they live, how they worship. And they preserved many documents out there that we have found. We found these Dead Sea Scrolls, which we believe were preserved by the Essenes. And they tell us a lot about their community life, that they had very high messianic hopes, that they wrote commentaries on virtually every book of the Old Testament. There's a scroll of almost every book of the Old Testament that we know of in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a lot of stuff there, but we don't really encounter the Essenes in the New Testament because they're not in the cities. They're not in the villages. They're out away from all of this other stuff that's going on. We also have another group called the Zealots, and they're more political than they are religious. They are freedom fighters. They are rebels. They are revolutionaries. And oftentimes they would engage in political assassination of their enemies, especially the hated tax collectors, because the tax collectors were traitors. They collected taxes for Rome, and in order to earn their living, they extorted money from their fellow Jews. So those are our major players that we're going to encounter in the New Testament. Common practices of this time period included observance of the Mishnah, which was the oral law passed down by rabbinical tradition, orally, probably from the time of Ezra, all the way down to the New Testament. The Talmud is the tradition of the elders in writing that preserved this. Then we have the role of the synagogue. The synagogue began to develop during the Babylonian captivity as a means of preserving Israelite worship. It took 10 men to establish a synagogue. The pious Jew and the devout God-fearing Gentile would come together on Sabbath to read Scripture, to hear commentary on Scripture from a rabbi, perhaps to sing praises to God, and to pray, these sorts of things, much of like what we would observe in a church service today. And the ancient church's practice and design is very much based on life in the synagogue in this time period. We also have the Sanhedrin, which was the court of the 70, where criminal cases would be tried. And the one thing the Sanhedrin could not do was pronounce a death penalty on anyone. And so if they needed a death sentence, they had to take that to the Roman officials and get it approved. But this was the trial, the court of trial for the Jewish people. And we'll run into the Sanhedrin a lot in the New Testament. Temple worship played a huge role in Jewish life in the intertestamental period and in the time of Jesus. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt the temple after they came back from Babylonian exile during the Persian period. Herod the Great embellished and enlarged the temple, trying to gain favor with the Jewish people who didn't like him because he was an Idumean. And the temple was controlled by the priest. So the priest, in order to keep the temple functioning, had to maintain a close working relationship with Rome. And as long as they kept things peaceful, Rome was happy. And they had their own temple guard and all of that to help maintain the peace in the temple. Now, Paul argues in Galatians 4 that the time was right. Let's see if that is so. We have, at this time, Roman political stability. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Travel throughout the empire was relatively safe. You had a good road system. You had regular sea travel. Everything seemed to be set for the rapid dispersion of the gospel message in this regard. You have Greek as a universal language. Didn't matter what your mother tongue was, everybody spoke Greek. And that's key to the spread of the gospel. It was the language of the marketplace. Greek philosophy played a huge role in the early church. Paul utilizes Greek philosophy in his message at Athens, in his defense. The traditional Greco-Roman religions didn't provide a lot of comfort about the afterlife. They provided no basis for moral living. People looked to the philosophers for that. And so there was a gap, there was a hole spiritually in Greco-Roman religion that Christianity filled. Jewish monotheism, of course, established Christianity with a firm, solid, monotheistic foundation. And throughout this time period, outside of the Holy Land, Jews and God-fearing Gentiles alike used a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, or the LXX, 70, Roman numeral 70. It took this name from the tradition that it was 70 rabbis brought to Egypt by the Ptolemies to translate the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. And they made this translation, and the Greek text of the Old Testament became the standard text for Jewish communities throughout the empire outside of the Holy Land, and the standard text of the Old Testament for the early church. Even in the New Testament, we find many quotations are taken from the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. So, let's talk for just a moment then about the text of the New Testament. The text of the New Testament comes to us in Greek manuscripts, first and foremost. The earliest writings, as far as we know, were all in Greek. There's a tradition that that Matthew wrote a Hebrew version of his gospel. We have no credible document to prove that. A couple have been put forward and found not to hold up. But as far as we know, all of the New Testament was written originally in Greek. And the original documents that say Paul wrote or Luke wrote would be what we would call the autographs. Everything else is a copy, handwritten. We call those manuscripts, of which we literally have thousands of them. I think something over 5,000 manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament. They come to us in three basic text types: the Alexandrian text type, which is the oldest, the Byzantine, which was used by the Eastern Church, and the Western text, which was preserved in Rome and is the longest of the three versions. Other manuscripts include ancient translations in Coptic and Syriac and Ethiopic and these other various early languages of the ancient Near East. And so what do? We have all these handwritten copies. If you take and you write out a chapter of the New Testament by hand, copy it out of a Bible, and you hand it to your friend, and they make a handwritten copy of your handwritten copy, and then another person makes a handwritten copy of their handwritten copy, eventually some changes will creep in. Contractions will be used where they weren't before, or spelling errors, little things like that. We call these textual variants. Okay? Text criticism is how we handle textual variants. It is the science of studying all of these manuscripts to determine as accurately as possible what the original reading of the Greek text was in the autographs. And we actually have a high degree of confidence that what we hold today as the Greek New Testament is 99+% accurate to the autographs, and the little tiny less than 1% that's in question, I should say, doesn't affect any material point of doctrine. So we have a great deal of confidence in the reliability of our manuscripts. The New Testament comes to us on different types of material and in different types of writing. We have papyrus, which is a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant. Parchment, which is vellum, it's an animal skin, usually an uncial text, all capital letters, no spacing, no punctuation marks, very difficult to read. We have minuscule, which is a form of cursive. We have scrolls very early in the writing stage. We have scrolls. Then we have codices, which are basically bound books. You would a scribe would buy a blank bound book and write in it. We have fragments. Some of them as small as a postage stamp. Some of them size of a piece of paper. The oldest fragment we have is of John's Gospel from about 125, so very, very early. And so the text, the integrity of the text is an important issue to recognize. And what we have is we have a text with a very high degree of preservation. We have a huge amount of material to look at, much of it very ancient, especially in comparison to other ancient Near Eastern literature, such as Caesar's conquest of Gaul, of which only 9 extant ancient copies exist, and all of those are 1,000 years removed from the events of Caesar's lifetime, versus the New Testament, which we have manuscripts going back to within 100 to 150 years of the events recorded. So the time gap is very close. They're very close chronologically to the autographs. And so we're able to deal with textual variants very accurately and with a great deal of confidence. And that concludes this first part of the introductory lecture for this course.